Banished and alone. The cold wind howled through the narrow valleys of the planet Sci-Fi. The twin moons cast a silver glow on the rocky landscape, making the land look like a place of ghosts. The village of Zifrin, hidden between the cliffs, was quiet. But inside the great hall, voices were raised in anger. Lyra stood in the center of the hall, her hands clenched into fists. Her long silver hair fell over her shoulders, hiding the fear in her deep blue eyes. She had known this day would come, but she had not expected it to be so soon. "You are useless to us, Lyra," the elder's voice echoed in the room. His wrinkled face was filled with disgust. "A woman who cannot bring life into the world has no place among us." Lyra's heart pounded. She had heard these words before, whispered behind her back, spoken with pity, sometimes with hatred. But now, the words were final. "You are banished," the elder declared. "From this moment, you are no longer one of us. Leave and never return." A sharp pain stabbed her chest. She opened her mouth to protest, to beg, but she saw the faces of her people. There was no sympathy, no kindness, not even a single tear for her. Her own mother turned her face away. Her best friend lowered his head. No one would stand up for her. The warriors came forward, their tall, armored figures blocking her escape. One of them threw a bag at her feet. Inside, she saw only a small amount of food and water, just enough to survive for a few days. It was clear. They did not want her to live. They only wanted her to die far away, where they wouldn't have to see her. Lyra swallowed hard. She refused to let them see her cry. If they would not give her love, she would leave with her pride. She picked up the bag, threw it over her shoulder, and walked out of the great hall without looking back. The moment she stepped outside, the heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind her. She was alone, lost in the Westlands. The night was cold, but Lyra barely felt it. She walked through the dry lands, her boots kicking up dust with every step. She had no idea where to go. The wastelands stretched before her, endless and unforgiving. The ground was cracked, the air dry. Nothing lived here except creatures that hunted in the dark. Lyra shivered and pulled her thin cloak tighter around her shoulders. She could not stop now. If she did, she would freeze before dawn. Hours passed. Her legs ached, her throat burned with thirst. The food in her bag remained untouched. She had no appetite. Her mind replayed the words of the elder over and over again. Useless, barren, worthless. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to cry. She would not let them win. She would survive. But how? Where could she go? Her people had been everything to her. Without them, she was nothing. Lyra's knees wobbled, and she fell to the ground. She gasped for air, the weight of loneliness crushing her chest. Was this how her life would end? Vanished and forgotten. The hidden portal. Just as she was about to give up, a strange light flickered in the distance. Lyra blinked. Had she imagined it? She pushed herself to her feet and walked forward. The light grew stronger. It shimmered in the air, like ripples in water. It was not natural. Lyra stepped closer, and her breath caught in her throat. A portal. A large swirling circle of golden light floated in the air, pulsing with energy. She had heard of such things in ancient stories. Doorways to other worlds, places beyond imagination. But no one had seen one in thousands of years. Lyra hesitated. She had no idea where it led. It could take her somewhere worse than this wasteland, a place filled with monsters, a place she could never escape. But what choice did she have? Stay here and die, or take a chance on the unknown? She took a deep breath and stepped forward. The moment her body touched the glowing light, the world vanished around her. A powerful force pulled her in, spinning her through darkness and stars. For a brief moment, she felt weightless, like she was floating between worlds. Then, everything turned black. Falling into a new world, Lyra gasped as she woke up, her body aching all over. She was lying on something soft. Grass? She opened her eyes and saw a blue sky above her. Birds chirped in the distance. A gentle breeze brushed against her face. This was not Sci-Fi. She sat up slowly, looking around. Tall green trees surrounded her, their leaves dancing in the wind. The air was fresh, the sunlight warm. The world felt alive in a way she had never known before. Then she heard voices, strange voices. Lyra's heart pounded. She turned her head and saw them. Humans. They stood at the edge of the trees, staring at her with wide eyes. Before she could react, her vision blurred, and everything faded to darkness once again. The strangest world. The first thing Lyra felt was warmth. A gentle heat wrapped around her, nothing like the icy nights of Sci-Fi. The air smelled fresh, filled with scents she had never known before. Rich earth, green leaves, and something sweet like fruit. For a moment, she wondered if she had died. Then pain shot through her body. Her muscles ached, her head throbbed, and her throat was dry like cracked stone. She was alive. Slowly, she opened her eyes. Sunlight filtered through tall trees, their branches stretching high into the sky. The leaves glowed green, dancing in the wind. A strange blue sky stretched above her, with a single bright sun shining down. This was not Sci-Fi. Lyra blinked. Her mind struggled to understand. The colors were too bright, the air too soft. She had never seen trees so tall or a sky so pure. She pushed herself up with shaky arms and gasped. The ground beneath her was soft grass, unlike the hard rocky land of her home. She clenched a handful, feeling the cool blades press against her skin. Then she heard it. Voices. She froze. Her heart pounded. The voices were coming closer, deep, strong, and unfamiliar. Slowly, she turned her head, and then she saw them. Strange beings in a strange land. A group of tall figures stood at the edge of the trees, watching her. Their eyes were wide, their expressions unreadable. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. They were not Sci-Fians. Their skin was different, their hair dark, their faces rough. They wore simple clothes made of fabric, not armor or metal. And their eyes, they were filled with something she had never seen before. Curiosity. On Sci-Fi, when people looked at her, their eyes were filled with judgment, pity, or anger. But these beings, they looked at her as if she was something unknown, something mysterious. Lyra tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. She coughed, her body shaking from weakness. One of the figures, a tall man with dark brown skin and sharp eyes, stepped forward cautiously. He held something in his hands, a small wooden bowl filled with water. Lyra flinched. Would he attack? Would he chase her away like her own people had? But the man did not raise a weapon. He did not shout. Instead, he knelt down before her and gently placed the bowl in front of her. Lyra stared at it. Water. She needed it. But why was he giving it to her? On Sci-Fi, kindness was given only to the strong. The weak were ignored. No one had ever offered her anything without expecting something in return. Slowly, cautiously, she reached out and picked up the bowl. The cool water touched her fingers. She lifted it to her lips and drank. The moment the water touched her tongue, she nearly gasped. It was the purest water she had ever tasted, fresh, clean, and unlike anything on her homeworld. She drank it all in seconds, drops spilling over her chin. The humans watched in silence. Then the man spoke. His words were strange, a language she did not understand, but his voice was calm. He did not sound afraid. Lyra shook her head. I don't understand. The man tilted his head, as if trying to figure her out. Then he touched his own chest and spoke again. Joran. Lyra blinked. A name. He was telling her his name. She hesitated, then placed a hand on her own chest. Lyra. The humans looked at each other, whispering softly. She could not understand their words, but they did not seem hostile. Joran nodded and smiled. It was a simple thing, but it made Lyra's chest tighten. No one had ever smiled at her before, a goddess among them. The humans helped her stand. Her legs wobbled, but Joran and another woman steadied her. Their hands were warm, gentle. They led her through the trees towards their village. As they walked, Lyra noticed more strange things. Birds sang in the trees, their songs light and musical. A small creature with soft brown fur darted through the bushes. The air smelled of firewood and roasted food. Then, through the trees, she saw it. A village. Small wooden houses stood in a circle, smoke rising from their roofs. People, more humans, stood outside, talking, working, laughing. But the moment they saw Lyra, everything stopped. Men, women, and children stared at her. Some whispered, some pointed. Then something unexpected happened. A woman fell to her knees. Then another, and another. Within moments, the entire village was kneeling before her. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She took a step back, confused. Joran looked at her, eyes full of something strange. Awe. Respect. He spoke, his voice filled with reverence. Lyra didn't understand the words, but she knew the meaning in his eyes. They thought she was divine. A goddess. Her heart pounded. She had spent her whole life being called worthless. Her people had cast her out like she was nothing. But here, in this strange world, these humans saw her as something sacred. Why? What did they believe she was? And more importantly, what would happen if she told them the truth? A goddess among humans. Lyra stood frozen, her mind racing as the entire village knelt before her. The people, men, women, even children, bowed their heads as if she were something holy, untouchable. She had never seen anything like this before. On Sci-Fi, she had been called useless, unwanted. She had been cast out like a piece of broken metal, left to die alone. But here, on this strange world, these humans looked at her with reverence. Why? Joran, the man who had given her water, stood beside her. His eyes were filled with something she had never seen before. Not fear, not pity, but faith. He spoke, his deep voice steady, as if announcing something important. Lyra did not understand his words, but she could feel their weight. The villagers gasped. Some of them murmured softly, their eyes wide with awe. A few pressed their hands to their chests, whispering words she could not comprehend. Lyra's heart pounded. This was wrong. They had made a mistake. She was no goddess. She was just a woman, a banished woman, worthless in the eyes of her own people. She took a step back, her legs weak. The people watched her, waiting. She had to tell them. She had to make them understand. I am not. Lyra started, but before she could finish, a woman ran forward. She was older, her face lined with age, her gray-streaked hair tied behind her head. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she fell to her knees at Lyra's feet. She grabbed Lyra's hands and pressed them to her forehead. Lyra flinched. The woman's skin was hot, burning. Her body trembled. Her breathing was shallow, as if every inhale was a struggle. Lyra's eyes widened. The woman was sick. The crowd murmured louder. Joran looked at her, his expression pleading. Lyra realized what was happening. They thought she could heal the woman. Her stomach tightened. What was she supposed to do? She was no healer, no goddess. But the woman would not let go of her hands. Her grip was weak, desperate. Lyra swallowed hard. What if she did nothing? Would they be angry? Would they see her as a fraud? She had no choice. Slowly, she knelt down and held the woman's hands in hers. A miracle, or just science? Lyra took a deep breath. Her hands trembled as she placed them on the woman's forehead. The heat radiated through her fingers, hotter than anything she had ever felt. The village watched in complete silence. Lyra closed her eyes. She had seen healers before, on Sci-Fi. They used technology to repair injuries, to make the body stronger. She had no such tools, no such power. But she had to try something. She focused, breathed slowly. She had read once that the body could heal itself, that the mind had power over pain. Maybe, if she just believed, the woman might feel better. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Lyra's chest tightened. Had she failed? She opened her eyes, expecting to see disappointment, anger, betrayal. But instead, the woman's breathing steadied. The trembling in her body stopped. Her eyes, once filled with pain, were now calm. She touched her own chest, blinking in disbelief. Then she smiled. A soft, grateful smile. The crowd erupted into cheers. Lyra's heart pounded. What just happened? Had she actually done something? Or had the woman's body simply recovered on its own? Whatever the truth was, the villagers believed it was her. They began to chant, her name mixed with their words. Lyra, Lyra, Lyra. She felt dizzy. This was not what she wanted. She had come from a world where she had been nothing, and now she was being treated as everything. She was an outsider, a stranger. But to them, she was a savior, learning their ways. Days passed. Lyra stayed in the village, still struggling to understand her place in this new world. The humans gave her food, sweet fruit, roasted meat, fresh bread, more food than she had ever eaten before. They built a home for her, a small wooden hut near the center of the village. They treated her with respect, kindness, even love. She watched them, observed their ways. They had no advanced technology, no weapons like the warriors of Tychera. But they had intelligence, structure, community. They worked together, building homes, growing crops, sharing meals. They helped the weak, cared for the sick, protected their own. It was so different from what she had known. On Sci-Fi, the weak were left behind. The sick were cast out. There was no kindness without expectation, no love without condition. Here, it was different. Here, it felt like home. Lyra found herself helping where she could. She showed them how to build stronger houses, using the knowledge from her world. She helped them find better ways to store food. She taught them things, and in return, they taught her their language. Every day, she learned more words. Fire, water, sun, sky, home, family. She didn't realize how much she longed for those things until now. For the first time in her life, she felt wanted. But deep inside, a question remained. How long could this last? Would they always see her as a goddess? Or would they one day see the truth, that she was just a woman, no different from them? And if that day came, would they still accept her? Or would she be cast out once again? Lyra did not know. But for now, she had something she had never had before. A home. And she would protect it, no matter what. The power within. The night was quiet, but Lyra could not sleep. She lay on the soft mat inside the wooden hut the villagers had built for her. The walls were made of woven reeds and strong branches, and the scent of fresh earth filled the air. A small fire flickered outside, casting moving shadows on the walls. Lyra stared at the ceiling. Even now, days after arriving in this world, she still struggled to believe what was happening. She had been banished from her own people, cast out like a worthless object. She had been nothing. Yet here, in this village of humans, she was treated like something sacred. A goddess, a healer, a leader. But she was none of those things. She had no divine power. She could not work miracles. She was just Lyra. She closed her eyes, trying to push away her thoughts. But sleep refused to come. Then, a sudden sound outside made her sit up sharply. Footsteps. Soft, hesitant. Someone was approaching her hut. Lyra reached for the small knife the villagers had given her. She was still learning their ways, but she knew enough to understand that not all humans were friendly. The footsteps stopped. Then, a quiet voice spoke. Lyra. She recognized the voice immediately. Joran. She let out a breath and placed the knife back down. "Come in," she said, still speaking in the villagers' language as best as she could. Joran stepped inside, carrying the wooden bowl filled with water. His expression was serious, his dark eyes filled with something she could not name. He set the bowl down and motioned for her to sit. She obeyed, her heart pounding. "What is wrong?" Joran hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Lyra, there is something about you, something we do not understand." Lyra tensed. She had known this moment would come. The villagers believed she had healed the sick woman on her first day in the village. Lyra had thought it was a coincidence, that the woman's body had simply recovered on its own. But since then, more strange things had happened. A child with a high fever had held her hand, and the fever had broken within hours. A man with a wound on his arm had sat beside her, and the wound had closed faster than anyone had expected. Each time, the villagers whispered among themselves, calling her blessed, chosen, divine. But Lyra knew the truth. She had no magic, no power, and yet there was no denying the results. Joran took her hand in his. His grip was strong, steady. "You are not like us," he said softly. "You are more." Lyra's throat tightened. "No, I am just." Joran gently placed her hand in the bowl of water. Lyra flinched. The water was cold. Ice cold. She looked up at Joran, confused. He reached into the water and pulled her hand out. Lyra gasped. The water steamed where her skin had touched it. The villagers had been right. Something was happening to her. She stared at her palm, her heart racing. What was this? Was it something in this world? Had Earth's air, its water, its energy somehow changed her? Or had she always been different? She had been an outcast among her people, a failure, unworthy of carrying life. But what if there had been a reason? What if her body had been waiting for the right place to awaken? Joran watched her carefully. "You do not know what you are, do you?" Lyra shook her head, still staring at her steaming hand. For the first time, she wondered, was she truly powerless, or had she just never been given a chance to discover what she was capable of? A new purpose. The next morning, Lyra woke up feeling different. She stepped outside her hut and felt the warm earth beneath her feet, the wind against her skin. She was no longer just a guest in this world. She belonged here. For the first time in her life, she had a purpose. She spent the day with the villagers, helping them where she could. She worked alongside them, gathering food, carrying water, learning their ways. She was no longer just watching. She was living. That afternoon, a young boy ran toward her, his eyes wide with fear. "Lyra, Lyra," he gasped. She knelt beside him. "What is wrong?" The boy pointed toward the edge of the village. "The chief's son, he is dying." Lyra's heart clenched. She rushed toward the chief's hut, where a crowd had gathered. Inside, she found the village chief kneeling beside his son, a boy no older than 10. The child's skin was pale, his breath shallow. Sweat covered his forehead. Lyra touched his arm. His body burned with fever. The villagers watched her with hope, waiting for a miracle. Lyra swallowed hard. This was it. She could walk away, tell them she was no goddess, that she had no power. Or she could try. She knelt beside the boy and closed her eyes. She placed her hands on his chest and focused, not on magic, not on miracles, but on life, on energy. She took slow, deep breaths. She felt something stir inside her, a warmth, a light, something she had never felt before. And then, the boy's breathing slowed. His fever broke. His body relaxed. Lyra pulled back, her chest rising and falling with exhaustion. The villagers gasped. Then, they cheered. The chief took her hands in his, tears in his eyes. "You are our savior," he whispered. Lyra looked around. The villagers' eyes shone with devotion, trust, love. They believed in her, And for the first time in her life, she believed in herself. Whatever she had become, whatever power had awakened within her, she would use it to protect them. Because now, these people were no longer just strangers. They were her family, and no one would ever take them from her. The warlord's threat. The sun had just begun to set over the village, casting a golden hue across the land. Smoke curled from cooking fires, and the scent of roasted meat and fresh bread filled the air. Children ran through the dirt paths, laughing and playing, while the villagers finished their day's work. Lyra stood at the edge of the village, looking out into the vast wilderness beyond. The past few days had changed her more than she ever thought possible. She had been nothing before, a banished outcast. Now she was everything to these people. A goddess, a healer, a protector. And yet, deep inside, a sense of unease lingered. She touched her palm, remembering the heat that had surged through her body when she healed the chief's son. It had been real. She had power. But how? Why? And more importantly, was she the only one who knew? The village had been peaceful since she arrived, but peace never lasted forever. And she was about to find out just how dangerous this world could be. The shadow on the horizon. It started with a messenger. A young boy, barely more than a child, ran into the village, panting, his face drenched in sweat. His clothes were torn, his feet bruised from running barefoot across the rough land. Joran caught him before he collapsed. What happened? The boy gasped for air, shaking. His eyes darted around, wild with fear. "They are coming," he whispered. A chill ran through the crowd. Lyra frowned. Who? The boy turned his gaze toward her, eyes filled with terror. The warlord. A name that brought fear. The villagers stiffened, their faces pale with fear. Mothers clutched their children. The men exchanged anxious glances. Joran's jaw tightened. He turned to Lyra, his voice heavy. "We need to talk." He led her into the chief's hut, where the elders had already gathered. Their eyes were filled with worry, dread. "The warlord's name is Verok," Joran explained, pacing. "He rules over the lands beyond the river, taking whatever he wants. Food, weapons, people." Lyra's stomach twisted. People. Joran nodded grimly. "He enslaves those who do not submit, and those who resist." An older woman, her hands trembling, finished his sentence. "They die." Lyra looked around. Has he attacked before? The chief, his face aged with wisdom, sighed. "Not yet. Our village has always been small, hidden. But now," Joran's voice was grim, "he has heard of you." Lyra's blood ran cold. The warlord's demand. The next morning, Verok's men arrived. A dozen warriors, dressed in crude armor of leather and metal, marched into the village as if they owned it. Their leader, a tall, scarred man with piercing black eyes, rode on horseback, his expression cold and merciless. The villagers gathered in silence, fear on their faces. Lyra stood beside Joran, her hands clenched. The leader dismounted and walked straight toward her, looking her up and down as if measuring her worth. "So," he said, his voice like gravel, "this is the so-called goddess." Lyra did not speak. She met his gaze, unflinching. The man smirked. "My lord Verok has heard of you. Your miracles, your powers." He stepped closer. "He wishes to meet you." Joran stepped in front of her. "She is not going anywhere." The warrior laughed. "You misunderstand. This is not a request." He turned to the crowd, his voice rising. "Verok has been merciful to this village, but that mercy has limits." His black eyes swept over them like a predator surveying prey. "If the woman does not come willingly," he unsheathed his sword, "we will take her." A collective gasp rippled through the villagers. Lyra's pulse pounded. She had spent so long being powerless, watching others decide her fate. But not anymore. She took a step forward, meeting the warrior's gaze. "I will not go with you." The man smirked. Then your people will suffer. Lyra's hands burned with heat. She felt something rise inside her, something primal, raw, powerful. The warrior reached for her arm. Before she could think, before she could stop herself, fire erupted from her fingertips. A bright, searing burst of heat flashed between them, sending the warrior stumbling backward, his eyes wide with shock. Lyra gasped, staring at her hands, at the faint glow still flickering around her fingers. The entire village fell silent. Even the warriors hesitated. The leader recovered quickly, his shock turning to something else. Hunger. He grinned. Varrock will be very interested in you. He stepped back, his eyes glittering. You have made your choice, he said. Now we will return with an army. With that, he and his men turned and rode away, leaving behind a village filled with fear. Lyra's hands still tingled with heat. She had revealed her power. Now, there was no turning back. Preparing for war. The village erupted into panic. We cannot fight them. They will burn our homes. They will take our children. Lyra raised her hands, silencing them. No, she said firmly. We will not let them take anything. The villagers stared at her, fear and hope warring in their eyes. Joran stepped forward. How? Lyra took a deep breath. She had been powerless once, but not anymore. We train, she said. We prepare. We fight. The elders looked at each other. Some shook their heads, but others nodded. Joran placed a hand on her shoulder. Then we have little time. Lyra turned toward the open fields, toward the horizon where Varrock's army would soon march. She had spent her life being cast aside, seen as weak, worthless. Now, she would show them all what she truly was. Not a goddess, not a victim, but a warrior. And when the warlord came, he would find a village ready to fight. The battle of the goddess. The sky over the village darkened as storm clouds gathered on the horizon. A strong wind swept through the trees, carrying the scent of rain and war. Lyra stood at the center of the village, watching the people prepare for the battle that would decide their fate. Children were sent to hide in the deepest parts of the forest. Women and elders gathered supplies, reinforcing their homes, knowing that if the village fell, there would be no escape. The men, farmers, hunters, craftsmen, held spears, bows, and whatever weapons they could forge from their tools. Their hands trembled, but their eyes burned with determination. They were not warriors, but they would fight like warriors. Lyra felt the weight of their trust pressing on her shoulders. These people had given her a home, a purpose. Now she would give them something in return. She would protect them. Joran approached, his expression grim. They will be here before sundown. Lyra nodded, clenching her fists. Then we are ready. But were they? Would this village of farmers stand a chance against a warlord's army? Lyra had never led a battle before, but she had one advantage that no one else had. Power. She had been given a gift. Something inside her had awakened. She had no idea how far it could go, but she knew one thing. Tonight, she would not hold back. The first attack, the first sign of the enemy came with the thunder of hooves. Lyra stood at the edge of the village, Joran and a group of warriors beside her. The ground trembled as Varrock's army approached, a wave of horses, warriors, and weapons. Their banners flapped in the wind, painted with the sigil of the warlord, a black sun, a symbol of destruction. Lyra's fingers tingled with power. She could feel the heat rising inside her, just beneath her skin, waiting to be released. A single war horn sounded from the enemy ranks. Then the attack began. A group of riders charged forward, swords glinting in the fading sunlight. Lyra raised her hands. The air around her rippled, and then, with a sudden burst, a wall of heat and fire exploded outward. The first wave of riders screamed as their horses reared back, terrified. Flames licked the air, forming an invisible barrier between the village and the attackers. The villagers gasped. Even Joran took a step back. Lyra's breath came fast, her hands trembling. She had never done anything like this before, and yet it had felt natural. The warlord's army hesitated. They had expected an easy victory. They had not expected her. But hesitation did not last long. Varrock's warriors regrouped, their leader stepping forward, a massive man clad in dark iron armor, a sword as long as a man's arm resting on his shoulder. Varrock. His eyes locked onto Lyra. "So," he said, his voice like thunder, "the goddess fights." He lifted his sword and pointed it at her. "Then let's see if she can bleed." The battle begins. The moment Varrock charged, everything exploded into chaos. The warriors behind him surged forward, weapons raised, their battle cries echoing through the night. Lyra took a deep breath and let her power flow. She thrust her hands forward, and fire erupted from her palms, forming a burning wave that swept across the battlefield. But Varrock was ready. He lifted his sword, and with one powerful swing, he split the fire in two. Lyra's eyes widened. He was no ordinary man. He kept coming. Fast, relentless, unstoppable. She barely dodged as his sword slashed through the air, missing her by inches. The force of the strike sent a shockwave through the ground. She stumbled back. Varrock grinned. "You are strong, but strength is not enough." Lyra narrowed her eyes. She would not lose. She raised her hands, summoning her power again. But this time, something different happened. The fire did not just burn. It crackled with energy, twisting and forming into something more. Lightning. A bolt of pure light and heat exploded from her hands, striking Varrock's sword. The weapon shattered, the metal melting from the impact. Varrock staggered back, his expression shifting from confidence to shock. Lyra stepped forward. "You wanted to see if I could bleed," she said. "Now it's your turn." A war won, a leader born. The battle raged on. Lyra fought with everything she had, her body moving like a force of nature. The villagers, inspired by her strength, fought harder than they ever had before. They used the land to their advantage, setting traps, ambushing the enemy, using their knowledge of the forest to outmaneuver the warriors who had never known true resistance. One by one, Varrock's forces fell. And finally, Varrock himself, kneeling in the dirt, defeated. His armor was broken, his face bloodied, his army scattered. He looked up at Lyra, his eyes filled with something she had not expected. Fear. "Finish it," he growled. Lyra stood over him, her hands glowing with power. She could end this. With one strike, she could destroy him. But she was not like him. She took a deep breath. "No." Varrock frowned. "No. You are beaten. You have no power here anymore." She lifted her gaze to the warriors who remained. "Leave. Go. And never return." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, Varrock lowered his head. One by one, his warriors dropped their weapons. The war was over. Lyra turned to the villagers, victorious. They stared at her, not with fear, but with respect. And then, they knelt. Not in worship, but in loyalty. They were not bowing to a goddess. They were bowing to their leader. Lyra had come to this world as an outcast, a woman without purpose. Now she stood as a warrior, a protector, a queen. And she would never be powerless again. A new purpose. The battlefield was silent. The only sounds were the distant cries of wounded warriors and the crackling of the last dying fires. The sun had long set, and the night sky stretched above them, clear, endless, and filled with stars. Lyra stood at the center of it all, her body aching, her hands still tingling with the last remnants of her power. She had won, not as a goddess, but as a warrior, a leader, a protector. She had faced an army. She had defied a warlord. And she had proven that she was not a weak, barren outcast, but something greater. The villagers surrounded her, their faces filled with awe and something else. Not fear, not worship. Loyalty. Joran stepped forward, his face smeared with dirt and sweat. He had fought beside her, risked his life alongside hers. Now he looked at her with something deep, unspoken. Respect. You saved us, he said. Lyra looked around, at the people who had fought, bled, and survived. No, she said. We saved each other. The villagers bowed their heads, not in submission, but in gratitude. This was her home now, and she would never let anyone take it from her. The war is over, but the journey is not. The next morning, the village began to rebuild. The fallen were honored, their names spoken with pride. The wounded were cared for, their bodies tended to with herbs and Lyra's strange, growing healing abilities. Lyra walked through the village, watching the people work together, feeling a sense of belonging she had never known before. She was one of them now. But deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning. The world was vast. The warlord's defeat would not go unnoticed. There were other threats, other dangers. And her power, it was changing, growing. She could feel it. Something inside her had awakened when she came to this world, and it was only getting stronger. Joran approached her as she stood at the edge of the village, gazing at the mountains in the distance. You're thinking about what comes next, he said. Lyra nodded. Varrock was powerful, but there will be others. Joran was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at her, his voice firm. Whatever comes, we will face it together. Lyra turned to him, seeing the trust in his eyes. Once she had been alone, banished, cast aside. But now, she had a family, a people, a purpose. She had a home, and she would protect it with everything she had. She turned back to the horizon, feeling the wind brush against her skin. The world was changing, and so was she. The legend of Lyra begins. Months passed. Lyra's name spread beyond the village, whispered in the lands beyond the rivers and mountains. The goddess who fights, the healer of fire, the Barren queen. She was no longer an outcast. She was a legend. And legends are only the beginning of something greater. Because out there, beyond the forests, beyond the mountains, something else was watching. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting for someone like her. And soon, they would come. Lyra had won her first battle. But the real war had only just begun.